Well, hey there, and welcome back to Heimler's History. Now, we've been going through Unit 4 of the AP Government Curriculum, and in this video, that means it's time to talk about how our political beliefs change as a result of generational and life cycle effects. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, then let's get to it. So in this video, here is what we're trying to do. Explain how cultural factors influence political attitudes and socialization. Now, if you saw the last video, we talked about the 6 main factors that influence the way we come to hold differing political opinions, and the term for that is political socialization. And we mentioned families, schools, peers, media, civic and religious organizations, and globalization. All of those factors affect the kinds of political opinions that we hold. So now let's talk about another factor that influences political ideology, namely a person's generation, and we'll talk about life cycle effects which can cause a person to change or modify his or her political opinions. So let's begin with generational effects. This basically means that a person's voting behavior and political ideology is very much influenced by the generation into which they're born. So let's briefly consider 4 major generations that are consistently analyzed by political scientists, namely the silent generation, baby boomers, Generation X, and millennials. Now, before I get into it, I should mention that everything I'm about to say here is a generalization, and that in reality there is great variance of voting behavior and political ideology in each generation, but here we're only focusing on generalizations that can be made. So let's start with the silent generation, and this includes folks that were born before 1945. They came of age during the Great Depression and World War II, and many of them were young adults during the age of conformity during the 1950s, and as such they tend to have a high value on religious belief and church attendance. Furthermore, many folks of the silent generation adhered to a social order that attached rigid gender roles to men and women. Thus, the folks in this generation are generally conservative. So, this leaning led some of them to oppose the great cultural upheaval in the 1960s with the counterculture movement and the women's rights movement and the gay liberation movement. After all, these movements tore apart the cultural fabric which these silents grew up with. Now, when it comes to foreign policy, these people grew up in the midst of the Cold War and thus generally supported American intervention abroad in order to stop the spread of communism, notably in the Vietnam War. Also, in general, the silent generation consistently votes for candidates who style themselves as tough on crime and terrorists, which is generally a conservative position. And one thing this generation can very much not understand is the push to legalize marijuana. Now, why on God's green earth would you hippies want to legalize that wacky tobacco? Anyway, as a group, senior citizens vote in higher numbers than any other group. Okay, now let's shift and talk about baby boomers. These are folks who were born after World War II up till about the mid-60s. The prosperity of the 50s combined with men and women returning home from war meant that people were making babies like mad, and so this is a huge generation. They came of age during the tumultuous 60s, and thus they learned to appreciate the changes better than their parents, and that meant they were slightly more liberal as a whole than the silent generation, though they still reliably voted conservative. Then came Generation X, who were born between the mid-60s and 1980. These were folks who grew up with lots of divorce and were the first to really use the internet as a generation. As a group, they were slightly more liberal than their parents in the baby boomer generation, partly because they're more ethnically diverse than either of the 2 previous generations that I've spoken about. Then we get to the millennials, who were born in the period 1981 to 1986, and this group is even more liberal than any of the previous generations that I've mentioned. Millennials are more ethnically diverse than Xers were, which is to say, according to Pew Research, about 40% of this group is not white, which is huge compared to the silent generation, which was 79% white. As a result of this, millennials have leaned hard into the liberal policies of the Democratic Party, and they're more likely than not to believe that racial discrimination plays a big role in society. They're more favorable towards immigrants than the previous generation, and in general, they are more favorable towards what could be considered more socialist policies with significant government intervention. Now, I spent all that time explaining some of these generational characteristics to you to make this point. The 4 generations of today's adults fit into a pretty tidy political pattern. The older you are, the more likely you are conservative, and the younger you are, the more likely you are liberal. Since the silent generation, each succeeding generation has become more liberal than their parents, and a good example of this is a poll from Pew Research that compared each generation's opinion on conservative President Donald Trump's performance. You can see here that 46% of the conservative silent generation approved, 44% of boomers, 36% of Xers, and 20% of millennials said that Trump was doing a good job. So, classified into groups, the 4 adult generations range from conservative to liberal, and depending on what generation you find yourself in, you are more likely than not to agree with this group's political affinities. So all that to say, generational effects can determine how you think about politics. But there are also life cycle effects that contribute to political socialization as well, and the idea here is that whatever stage of life a person is in will contribute to their political beliefs and behavior. For example, if you were 18 years old and casting your first vote during the 2020 presidential primaries, you might have been very attracted to a candidate like Bernie Sanders who ran on a platform of free college tuition. At that stage in your life, that matters a lot to you, especially since college has gotten so expensive and you're not interested in paying for your ceramics degree until you're 73. But those in the silent generation who are not going to college and have adult children children and grandchildren, they don't care as much about that. And they're thinking like, yeah, somebody has to pay for all of that. So they would, in general, be less attracted to that proposal because of where they are in their life. But then maybe you get married and you have kids, and at that stage in your life cycle, you're less interested in free college tuition than you are in pre-K legislation or lower taxes so that you can better care for your family, and those commitments might lead you to change your voting behavior. So the point is, political socialization happens as a result of your generational membership, and it can change over time as you progress through different stages of life. Okay, thanks for watching. Click right here and grab a review packet if you need help getting an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. If you're watching this and you're a millennial, and you probably are, then you don't need me to tell you that subscribing is the best way for you to let me know to keep making these videos. So I'll see you in the next one. Heimler out.